Hi everyone. Today I want to talk to you about Biomodd. Biomodd is a series of projects that I have been working with in collaboration with a bunch of different artists, scientists, and designers from all over the world since about 2008. The very first Biomodd project that I worked on was actually at the UP Open University. And today I really want to talk a little bit about what the project has been about, how it's evolved, and how art, science, culture, and community have met to produce Biomodd. So this talk is actually based on a paper that I presented about 3 years ago at a conference called IZEA, which is the International Symposium on Electronic Arts in Vancouver. And if you wanted to read the paper, please check out this URL. So the Biomodd series of projects started about 10 years ago in 2008, when artist and scientist Angela Vermeulen, who is from Belgium, was a resident at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. So what he had done was he had gotten together a group of people, artists and scientists and designers, and they had come together and put and designed this installation that you see here. So what you see here is a tank of algae that's being used to cool at least one of the computers that's inside this big plexiglass enclosed case. This tank of algae then gets too hot because it's being used to cool computers, and so you cool the algae itself in another tank full of tropical fish. Tropical fish benefit from the heat of the hot algae, and the algae is cooled in the process. So this is an example of a symbiotic relationship between biological and electronic systems. The computers that are inside the plexiglass case are actually old computers that have been made to run again. So the project was also really concerned about electronic waste and how to creatively reuse it. This project is actually inspired by a practice called case modding, which is when you take a computer and you give it a whole new look by changing its components, by changing the way it's being cooled. For example, you can cool a computer not by using a fan, but by submerging it in mineral oil, for example. This project was also really concerned about digital games. So if you remember the previous slide, the installation was actually surrounded by a bunch of gaming stations. These gaming stations allow you to think of this installation as a kind of a multiplayer living game station. Finally, this installation was created in a way that was collaborative, where everyone had to step out of the role as scientist or gardener or biologist or artist to come up with something really quite unique. One of the things that I'm going to be talking about later on is how the Biomodd project juxtaposes the local and the global, and we'll get to that in a little bit. This project also used a lot of open source technologies. So the games were run on an open source operating system called Linux, and the game itself was open source. This is a view of how the game looks. This game is based on a game called Armageddon, where it's a racing game. This is a view of the case inside, so you can see that the plants there are being watered, and the computer is being cooled by this algae that is running through the plastic tube. So this was back in 2008. I met Angelo back then, and I decided to invite him to come give a talk at the University of the Philippines Open University. And people at the Open University were so excited by the idea that we decided to see what would happen if we built a version of Biomodd in the Philippines. What would it look like? And this is what it looked like. So I'm going to talk about the version that we did in the Philippines by breaking apart into various different components. And in doing so, you'll kind of have an idea of what happens when you take an idea, when you take a piece of new media art that was created in the West, transported into the global South, to the Philippines, and all the kinds of challenges and opportunities and problems that arose when you try to port one idea into a different context. And so the discussion that I'm going to give today is very largely inspired by a post-colonial lens of looking at things. Post-colonial discourse is discourse that is centered around questions about power, authority, legitimacy, and participation, especially in the context of cultural encounter, and particularly in contemporary globalization. So there are 8 components of the Biomodd sculpture, which was called LBA2, which stands for Los Baños' second version. So there are 8 components that I want to talk to you about today. The first was our use of, or actually our reuse of heat in the tropics. So if you remember, in the original Biomodd Athens, Ohio version, they had taken excess heat generated by computers and they reused it so that it could benefit other living systems, such as algae or tropical fish. Of course, the problem is, in the tropics, in the Philippines, we already have a lot of heat. So what do you do with this excess heat? You can't do the same thing or exactly the same thing they had done back in Athens, Ohio. Working with a bunch of band students from UPOU, we realized that what we could do was take another system called hydroponics and integrate it into the system. So in the Los Baños version of Biomodd, what we decided to do was to use the excess heat from the computers into growing fish using a hydroponic system. It was still a bit of a stretch trying to reuse the excess heat from the computers because the imbalance in heat was still not as great as it was in the West. But this was something that our students had really tried to work on. And you can see in this slide how we were experimenting with using different kinds of tropical fish to reuse the heat from the computers. The other thing that was very special about the original Biomodd installation was that the algae that was originally from Athens, Ohio, was meant to be imported here and then mixed with the Philippine algae. When we first brought up this idea with all the participants in Biomodd and with the faculty and the staff at the Open University, there was a lot of discussion about why should we take algae from another place and mix it with our own algae. And this really points to uneasiness we have around colonization and hybridity and what does it mean to be authentic. After a lot of discussion, we did decide, after all, to mix algae, to take algae from the US and mix it with the algae from the Philippines. Because the thing is, that algae from the US, that wasn't even just from the US. That algae had originally come from Angelo's studio in Belgium. And so by the time that the algae from the US had come here, it was already a hybrid between Belgian, American, and now Filipino algae. We've done many biomodds since then, and now the current strain of algae is a mixture of algae from all over Europe, but also New Zealand, other parts of North America, and other parts of Asia. I'll show you more of these Biomodd installations in a little bit. Here's another view of the installation. Here you can see the big tank of algae being used to cool a computer that is inside this 10-foot-high case made out of coconut lumber, recycled coconut lumber. The other thing that was really interesting about trying to transport the idea of Biomodd from the US to the Philippines was this idea of what counts as waste. So when I went to a recycling center with Angela, and we always have a laugh about the story when we recount this, I take Angela to the recycling center in Los Baños in Laguna. We sit down with the plant manager, and I did not think to ask Angelo what he meant by second-hand computers back then. And so the plant manager goes, okay, so what kind of second-hand computers do you need? And Angela goes, oh, we need minimum Pentium 4s. Back in 2008, Pentium 4s were not considered second-hand computers in the Philippines. I mean, many people were still using Pentium 2s back then. And then in that moment, we had this huge discussion about, well, we can't just easily find Pentium 4s lying around in some junkyard in the Philippines. But at the same time, we couldn't run the games that we wanted to install in these computers if we had only Pentium 2s. So one of the things that I had learned very quickly was what other people define as waste can be very different in the East, or rather in the global South, versus in the developed world. This is a picture of that recycling center in Laguna. And so we needed not to recycle Pentium 4s, but to desperately look for Pentium 4s, which meant that we had to fundraise. And it was really an interesting experience trying to fundraise for Biomodd, because back then, back in 2008, it was really harder to sell the idea of art meets science as a kind of a thing that was worth funding. And so we would approach all sorts of sponsors. I mean, we already got a lot of support from the University of the Philippines, but we needed more. We needed more money to buy materials, to be able to feed our volunteers, and we approached different companies. And they were very supportive, but they just could not give us any money. So they gave us hot dogs and vodka and in all sorts of really, really, really funny things. And somehow we had to convert that into money. And so, for example, we had a events night where we took the vodka, we made a Biomodd-inspired drink that looked like algae, and then we sold it. We took hot dogs and we sold them. We roasted them, we grilled them, we barbecued them, and then we sold them. We even had this drive where if you put in 20 pesos in a bowl, we would get your picture taken, we'd put it up on the Biomodd website. So it's really interesting trying to convince other people of the importance of projects where art meets science. Another issue that came up that was really touched in the heart of what it means to be authentic and to be authentically Filipino is this idea of sampling and appropriating and remixing. So what you see here is the game that we had eventually developed. One of the Biomodd volunteers had eventually developed. So in this game, you had to grow the forest. And the way you grew the forest was you were in a group of players, and some of you would have to kind of scrub the forest in order to make it grow, and then some of you had to build walls around the forest to prevent these baddies, which you see as these kind of square circular dots. You had to prevent these baddies from coming in and attacking the forest. And right in the center, that spiral thing that you see in the center, that's a virtual representation of Maria from Maria Makiling, because you have to remember that the installation was built in UP Open University in its campus in Los Baños, which is right in the foot of Mount Makiling. And so we decided that the mythology of Makiling and Maria Makiling was going to be at the center of Biomodd. But you know, it's interesting because at some point in the past, there was talk about integrating the mountain of Makiling, but maybe another mountain like Banahaw in the story, in the gameplay. And there was a lot of resistance to it because you had to present some kind of, you have to preserve some kind of authenticity to the story. And we never got that fully resolved. Banahaw never made its way to the final version of the installation. But it was still interesting that there are some things that we didn't feel like we could easily sample or appropriate or remix. This is just an example of another way that we incorporated the mythology of Maria Makiling into the sculpture. So we worked with the local woodcarving community. We found a young woodcarver, the son of one of the Paete woodcarvers, and he agreed to work with us and to design kind of almost like the kind of sculpture we'd find on the prow of a ship that would represent Maria. And then we would mount Maria on top of that 10-foot high case made of recycled coconut lumber. The original idea was actually that we would create these really unusual sci-fi carvings all over the case. But there was a lot of discussion about whether that was authentic in any way. And we also ran out of time. So one of the important things in terms of thinking about how art is made is that sometimes you don't do things, not because you have a really, really good artistic reason for not doing it, but you run out of time, or you run out of money, or you run out of patience, and you just go, that's it, we're done, this is what we're presenting. Finally, one of the most interesting things that I really found about in the evolution of Biomodd over the past 10 years was the transformation of the form factor of Biomodd. So if you remember, the Athens, Ohio version of Biomodd was this monolithic kind of structure. The Biomodd version in Los Baños was similarly monolithic. In fact, it was even bigger. And it kind of reminds me of what the philosophers Deleuze and Guattari calls the tree structure, which is monolithic and singular, versus what they call the rhizomatic structure, which is more distributed and it's harder to disrupt. And I'll give you an example of what a rhizome is. Ginger is a classic rhizome. If you take a piece of ginger and you cut it, those two pieces will survive. The internet is very much rhizomatic in structure. If you cut one part of the internet, you will not completely destroy the internet. But many other things in nature are quite tree-like, or rather, they're rather not rhizomatic in structure. So for example, with humans, we're quite sensitive. If you cut off my head, for example, I'm dead. There's no question about it. But if you take a plant, if you cut off even like a big chunk of that plant will still survive because it's distributed a lot of its function everywhere. Over the years, as we've been making Biomodd structures, we've been moving away from the big monolithic tree-like structures to a bit more distributed versions. And so, for example, this is a version that was recently built in Taiwan. I wasn't part of this one, but it's interesting how you can see that it's become less of a big single structure and it's become more open. It also looks a bit more like a vehicle, almost like a spaceship, and I'll get to that in a little bit about why this looks a bit more like a spaceship in a bit. We've done also a smaller workshops, so here you'll see some versions of like mini Biomods that were done in Belgium and in London. And in these ones, you'll see kind of tiny Biomods, and you can connect all of these tiny Biomods together. So it kind of imbibes more of that idea of the rhizome. In fact, what you're seeing here is the latest version of Biomodd, which we did in Mechelen in Belgium. And here, instead of one single monolithic case, you distributed connected Biomodd structures all over this beautiful space, which was in the heart of this cathedral that was like 400 years old. It was an incredible experience, and it was really wonderful working with the artists and the carpenters and the gardeners who were native to that area, because that's also one of the things that's really special about the Biomodd concept. I mentioned earlier that one of the themes of Biomodd is juxtaposing the global with the local. The algae is one example of how you take something from outside your local context and mixing it, hybridizing it with what is local to you. But we also take parts like the water cooling system from one installation in Biomodd. We take it and we reuse it in another context altogether. Some of the motherboards here we've been using for a number of years now. But at the end of it all, we also give away a lot of the Biomodd materials that we used. So earlier I mentioned how the Taiwan version of Biomodd looks a little bit like a spaceship, doesn't it? One of the things that our group is now really interested in working in is taking the Biomodd concept but extending it a bit further. So now we're working with communities so that they can create a Biomodd that they can live in. Basically, we're asking people to design their own starships. This version is called Seeker. So in the Seeker project, we get a bunch of people, we build and prototype a starship, and then we live in it as an artistic concept, as a performance piece. And so often we would build this in a museum, and then we would live in the Seeker installation. One of the things that I would love to do is eventually to get Seeker to have a Seeker project built in the Philippines. That would be really exciting, I think. So just to conclude, this is kind of an overview of all the different versions of Biomodd that we had done over the years. One of the most fabulous things that we had managed to accomplish back in 2008, 2009, when we built the Biomodd version in Los Baños, was we got students from the BAMS program to kind of create their own version of Biomodd, and they exhibited it at a local conference. And that was really exciting. If you want to learn more about Biomodd, you can go to our website, either the UPOU website or the SEED website. Now SEED, which stands for Space Ecologies, Art and Design, is that group of people that I had mentioned, this group of artists and scientists and designers from all over the world trying to reimagine the future by integrating art, design, science, and technology. And right now we're working with UPOU to develop a bunch of interesting and exciting projects. Thank you for your time.